We're in Acts chapter 25. Last Acts class that we had, we ended here in the first couple of verses of Acts chapter 25. All right. So we have noticed how that Paul, man, that sounds loud. Did we turn this up at all last Sunday? Do y'all know? A couple weeks ago, we finished chapter 24. We studied how that Paul was kept under house arrest by Felix, and then he was hoping to receive a bribe from Paul or from those who were helping Paul, perhaps from the saints, to let him go. 2 years pass. Felix is replaced by Festus. Festus is kind of going through the region. He goes to Jerusalem. He kind of parades himself. He's the new governor. It's kind of a welcoming parade type of deal to present himself and to kind of introduce himself to the leaders of the Jews. We see that here in verse 1. Then the high priest, chief men of the Jews, informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against Paul, that he would summon Paul to Jerusalem while they lie in ambush along the road to kill him. And we ended the last Acts class by discussing the fact that I firmly believe that had Festus gone along with this plan, even though he didn't know about the plan, but had he gone along with the request to allow Paul to come to Jerusalem to be examined or tried, that those men who were going to kill Paul, they would have had to go through these Roman guards to get to him. And it's very, very likely that the rebellion against Rome would have started far earlier, 5 or 6 years earlier, than it was actually supposed to happen. So we see God's providence, of course, is working in this as well. So in verse 4, Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. Festus, to his end, I don't know how it worked when one governor would come and replace the other, if there was a sharing of information, if there was a governor's log or something that they could read up on the situations and who we've got in prison, who we've got under house arrest or whatever, or protective custody. So I don't know if Festus was intimately familiar with the details of the situation with Paul, that he knew or was aware that Paul even existed. Well, at this point he certainly does, because he's being asked about. But it would seem that Festus probably knew that they had Paul there, even though I would assume that he didn't have any knowledge of the backstory, especially as we read on down through chapter 25. He requests the help of Agrippa to help him to understand what's going on. So it doesn't sound like Festus, if he does have an awareness of Paul, it is not a deep understanding of the situations. That's why he invites the Jews to come back. Let's examine him. Let's redo this thing, because Felix didn't accomplish anything with his examination. And so now let's re-examine it. Let's see what the facts are here. So in verse 6, when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. The next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. It is interesting, and keep in mind, Festus, he's aware of two main issues. One, he has to keep the peace. Okay, that's his primary mission, is to keep the peace. Two is, in order to do one, he has to ingratiate himself to the Jews. He has to be able to have a relationship with the Jews and be on good terms with them. And so, seemingly pretty quickly, this is on the docket for him to take care of. Okay, I mean, the next day after he gets back from having been in Jerusalem for his welcoming tour or whatever, he comes back, and the very next day, he brings Paul. Okay, and we see in verse 7, when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Keep in mind, earlier, when Felix did this, we know what the high priest and the other members of the Sanhedrin were there, but his actual accusers were not. Okay, the quote-unquote eyewitnesses of the original issue of Paul taking Trophimus into the temple, that issue hasn't been addressed. at least as far as what Luke records for us, no eyewitnesses have come to make that, to levy that accusation. So we're still dealing with hearsay. Presumably the complaints or the accusations against Paul are going to be the same ones that were delivered to Felix. Okay, so what they're saying here in verse 7, that's why Luke doesn't really go into any detail about it, because it's not going to be any different. It's going to be the exact same issues that were brought up before, and they're just repeating it for Festus. So in verse 8, Paul answered for himself. He answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. Notice you have the law of the Jews, Caesar, which that would also encompass the law of the Romans, okay? When it comes to governing law, either by the local law of the Jews or by the Roman overarching law, Paul hasn't broken any laws, okay? Then he says, I haven't offended against the temple either. And that deals directly with the specific issue that had been brought, that he defiled the temple, and that there are certain demands of consequence per the Jewish law. And that's why it's interesting to me that Paul includes the temple in what he says. He says, not against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. There are three different areas of concern here. So if he discusses the law of the Jews, I haven't done anything to offend the law of the Jews, I haven't done anything to offend the law of Caesar, what does the temple represent in this triad? Huh? God's law, yeah, or more specifically, the spiritual aspect of the old law, okay? Because when he says, I haven't done anything against the law of the Jews, that's the civil aspect of the law of the Jews I'm convinced that Paul's referencing there. I haven't done anything unlawful with regard to the civil binding of the Mosaic law. Keep in mind, he was actually in support of that and showing that through his vow, that he was in the temple concluding when all this took place. He did nothing against the civil law of the Romans, but the temple represents the religious binding of the Mosaical law. But even under the Mosaical law, the religious binding of it, Paul had done nothing to offend. And he had gone and he had performed a vow. He didn't do anything. He didn't defile the temple. Not that it would have mattered. It's just a place now. It's not important. Paul knows that. But he would never have done that anyway. He didn't take Trophimus in there. And so it's these three areas of issue that Paul says, I haven't caused any offense. I haven't done anything contrary to any three of these laws. The Mosaical law being split between the civil and the spiritual and then the Roman law. Thoughts or comments through verse 8? Yes, sir.
Paul he's arguing his case before a Roman governor. And the Roman view was all the lands that they conquered, you can keep your religions, and as long as people don't offend against those religions, there will be peace, which, as you've mentioned, was his primary concern. So if Paul were offending the Jewish religion by defiling the temple, that would have been chargeable.
Sure.
So you got the civil law of the nation, the civil law of Rome, and a violation of the peace by defiling their religion.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, and certainly had Paul done what they said that he did, that would be an issue, okay? But Paul didn't. They couldn't prove it. Even 2 years prior, they never, as far as we know, brought these eyewitnesses to levy these accusations against Paul. So, verse 9, Festus wanting to do the Jews a favor. Have we read that phrase at some point earlier? Recently? Yeah, Felix, at the end of chapter 24, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul, quote unquote, bound. Again, he's not in shackles and chains. He's not accused of anything. Roman law wouldn't permit that. But he's bound in the sense he's under protective custody, protective guard, house arrest type of thing. But he's being kept there, okay? Both Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, okay, continuing this relationship, political favor being gained from that. Now, Festus, in the beginning of his governing, this is something he wants to establish as a good relationship with the Jews. And so, verse 9, But, and again, keep in mind, they have to balance this, though, with the Roman law, that this is a Roman citizen they're dealing with. So, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" It's interesting that when we read what the request was, they petitioned him, verse 3, asking a favor against him that he would summon him to Jerusalem. Of course, they don't tell Festus that they're going to lie in wait to ambush Paul on the road. But summon him to Jerusalem and examine him here. What's the difference? Okay, the only difference between examining him there in Caesarea at the seat of Festus's power and coming to Jerusalem to acknowledge, I guess there could be, to a certain extent, an acknowledgement of Jewish law, okay, from that perspective. But it's not going to change anything. The facts are still going to be the facts. If there were actual eyewitnesses, they can come. In fact, Festus invited anyone who has accusation, come to Caesarea, and we'll deal with this. 2 years prior, Felix said the same thing. They haven't produced these eyewitnesses. Ultimately, this was a favor they were asking. The question, if I'm Festus, I would have to ask, for what purpose would they want me to go to Jerusalem to do this? What new details are going to come out? What new evidence is going to be presented that they couldn't present here? Okay, that's why it says Festus wanting to do them a favor. He didn't think about it too much. He didn't look into it too deeply. They made this request, and he's going to do it. Or he was leaning towards wanting to do it, and of course we're going to find out why he doesn't. For that reason, to kind of ingratiate himself with the Jews. Ben or somebody back there? Yeah.
To me, that request is kind of a dual thing. First for the ambush part of it, and the second would be like home field advantage.
Yeah.
You got all that influence in Jerusalem, and tell them what pressure they could exert and make things happen for them the way they want it to be.
Well, and keep in mind, 2 years have passed, okay? At the time when it happened, was Jerusalem all riled up? Okay, you had a multitude of people that were riled up, even though initially the only people who knew about it were the ones that had accused Paul of taking Trophimus into the temple. But still, you had a multitude of Jews who tried to kill Paul, and with violence, Lysias and the rest of the soldiers had to take Paul away from them. Then the Sanhedrin got into it over Paul, so that was fresh 2 years ago. But as of now, you would think that those who had any vested interest in it might have kept up with the situation. But those who just kind of got caught up in the moment, in the mob mentality type situation, they probably long forgotten about it. Many of them. Okay? Or maybe don't even care anymore. So it's interesting to me, going to your point, Ben, that the home field advantage, there's a lot of ruckus that the elders and the chief priests and all these could do, could cause, much like they did with Jesus. Okay, crucify him. They get the crowd up in a tumult. Crucify him. I would venture to say, and of course, obviously, the Jews had every intention of killing Paul before he ever got to Jerusalem. There's no thinking about, well, what if he ends up here? Even if he did, though, I think a similar type of situation would have took place that happened with Jesus. The pressure on Festus would have been so great, and Festus would not have had any, other than having to deal with the fact that Paul's a Roman citizen. How Festus would have been able to handle that in that particular case, either I keep Paul safe and threaten a riot, or I let them take Paul, but then as a Roman citizen, they're killing. I'm thinking that if Festus, given his nature, or at least what we see of his nature, would have eventually said, it seems to me that the accusations are such that you did break the law, speaking to James's point, in that you defiled the temple, caused a problem, this is an issue, so you are forfeiting, this is your due process, you're forfeiting your right as a Roman citizen, and I'm going to hand you over to the Jews. I tend to think that that's where Festus would have landed. Regardless, it's moot. Okay, anything else through verse 9? Yes, sir.
Maybe something to forming of the political alliances with this guy just taking office back in verse 2 and 3. The Jewish leaders immediately come to him and performing, they're beseeching, they're asking a favor.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's, you do this for us, here's what we'll do for you down the road.
Well, and for the most part, the people kind of, whatever the elders and the chief priests and the leaders told them to do, they pretty much did. Okay, they were easily swayed. And so making sure that you have a good relationship with the leaders of the Jews early, 12 days, 13 days into his governorship, this is going to be important for him. So yeah, there's a political situation at play. And I say that as if it's, all baseless, but Roman politics was life and death, wasn't it? Roman politics was serious. And so a lot of it was Festus not just looking out for his political career, but his own life in many ways too, trying to keep the peace. All right, verse 10. So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. This was a unique situation and unique right available to Roman citizens. And I don't have the details of the differences between born free versus purchasing your freedom, but there are some suggestions that had Paul simply purchased his freedom, he wouldn't have had access to that right. But because he was born free, born a Roman citizen, that right to appeal to Caesar was exclusive. So in verse 10, when he says, to the Jews I've done no wrong, as you very well know, it's not that Festus has inside information that Paul didn't do it. The fact is, they haven't presented evidence, and that's the very definition of due process. Okay, due process is innocence until proven guilty. That concept goes hand in hand. They presented no evidence, and you know this. Verse 11, he says, and it's interesting because there are people who attempt to kind of twist the situation to associate political, even today, political nuances from the situation that Paul's in by trying to make the case Paul was against capital punishment. But is that what Paul says? Paul doesn't say he's for capital punishment either. What he says is he acknowledges that capital punishment was a form of discipline under the law, both the Jewish law and the Roman law. Okay, it always has been for the most part for man's history. That being the case, what Paul says is, if I had done anything deserving of death, then I'd be willing to die. Okay, if Paul was indeed guilty of anything that the Jews, according to the law of God, says that is worthy of death, or that the Roman law declares is worthy of death, I wouldn't put up a fight about it. Okay, I would deserve it. And so he's acknowledging the law that exists. This is not the Bible saying capital punishment is wrong or that capital punishment is necessary or is right. That's not what Paul, or for that matter, the Bible is making a case about. It's acknowledging the case of submitting to the authorities and the law that exists in place. And that's exactly what Paul does. So when Paul says here in verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. Since Paul's not getting and when I say fair hearing, it's not fair because is Festus biased? This early on in his governorship, is he biased already? Yeah. Not because necessarily of anything he knows or doesn't know, but because of the relationship he's seeking to establish with the Jews. Therefore, he's going to, at the very least, overlook whatever motivations the Jews had in bringing him to Jerusalem. And you would think Festus, even though Festus doesn't really have a lot of back knowledge on this situation, that's a very precipitous situation to put himself in early on in his governorship. Very precarious, because to put himself in that situation, surrounded by the Jews, surrounded by their leaders, acknowledging the deep seated resentment and pure hatred that these leaders have towards Paul and the issues surrounding it, that would put him in a situation, again, like I said, that would end up probably having to land him on ruling against Paul. I think he would almost have to in order to keep the peace. All right, so verse 11, he says, I'm willing to die But there's nothing in these things, verse 11, of which these men accuse me. There's no evidence, there's no proof, and there's no truth. No one can deliver me to them. And that's what Paul knew was going to happen. If I go to Jerusalem, you're going to deliver me to the Jews. And Paul knew that. I appealed to Caesar. So I'm going to appeal to Caesar. Caesar can have the last word in this matter. Ben, go ahead.
You just kind of said what I was about to, about him equating going to Jerusalem with death.
Yeah.
And that was his argument, was I'm already dead if I go to Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yeah. And granted, to be fair, Paul, as far as we know, Paul's not aware of what the ulterior plan is of the leaders of the Jews. Although it probably wouldn't be a very hard jump for him to make that conclusion. Okay, they had already planned this, and Paul knew about that. His nephew was the one that warned the centurion, remember? So Paul, it's likely Paul was already thinking, okay, they want me in Jerusalem, if not to pressure Festus to hand me over to them, then they're wanting to kill me on my way there. Okay, I'm sure Paul's not stupid. Okay, he probably was aware, or at least the possibility of that being the case. But like you said, either way, whether the ambush, Paul's in some way thinking, okay, there could be an ambush, or Festus is likely going to be pressured to hand me over. Either way, how's it end? Paul's dead. Okay? And so Paul appeals to Caesar. That is his right as a Roman citizen. And we'll talk about chapter 26 later. Okay, so verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "You have appealed to Caesar you shall go." I know the exclamation mark is there, but and sometimes the English language, we put these types of symbols there, and it kind of gives an impression inside our head as to how they're saying it, the tone in with which they're saying it. It's not that he's angry. Festus is saying that. I remember when I was growing up, I used to read this, and I was thinking, he's angry about it. I don't think Festus is angry. Okay? In fact, in many ways, this is kind of letting Festus off the hook. Okay? Even though the Jews aren't getting what they want, they can't blame Festus for it. Okay? Paul has appealed via Roman law, which is his right at least as a born citizen of Rome, to appeal to Caesar. Okay? If the Jews want to go to Rome and levy their accusation, if they're that confident in it and they have their proof, then let them go to Caesar and appeal to Caesar for it. But Festus is kind of being let out of this quandary by Paul. Okay, so I don't think Festus is angry or upset. Yeah, the Jews don't get what they want. Festus doesn't really get the means to be able to nurture a relationship with the Jews by doing them a favor here. But in the end, it's kind of like a scratch. You know, nobody really ends up happy, or particularly, well, the Jews will probably be upset, but they always were when it came to Paul. Yeah, no political leveraging taking place. It's kind of just it's a scratch, and okay, to Caesar you'll go. See, the whole reason I point that out is this is not saying this as if he's angry or upset about it. I think that it's a declaration. That's why the exclamation mark is there. It's a declaration. You appeal to Caesar you shall go, and that's the end of it. That's it. There's nothing else to be done. The Jews can't appeal that. They can't argue with that. It is that you've appealed to Caesar and it's done. Yes, sir.
Besides Paul maybe having a thought of, if I go back there, it would be physically dangerous for me, do we see in this something about his character, a humility he has of, my thought might be, if I'm Paul's shoes, I can go back there and clear my name. I mean, they brought all this stuff against me, there's no evidence though, they can't prove it, take it back there and among my own people, you know, show I'm really, there's other more important things to go elsewhere and serve God rather than.
And do you remember what Jesus had told Paul way back in Jerusalem before all this started? Or while Paul was being held by Lysias before he ended up being sent to Caesarea? You're going to appeal, or you're going to give testimony of me before Caesar in Rome. Okay, so remember we talked then about the fact that knowing that he wasn't going to die there in Jerusalem, that there was going to be something further he was going to do and accomplish, may have changed the way he thought about the process, okay? Now, 2 years into this thing, 2 years plus into this thing, here he is. He sees the situation. He sees the scenario. Was there any hesitation from Paul, do you think, to appeal to Caesar? No. No. Had there been had it been a situation where the Jews never showed up, okay, you know what, Festus, we don't care anymore. Just whatever you want to do. Let him go. We don't care, okay? Then it would have all gone to naught, and Paul would have had no reason to appeal to Caesar. But legally, Paul is now in a position, because Festus is biased, because nothing new is going to happen if we go to Jerusalem, and if anything, it's just going to end up in my death. I'm in a situation where I have the legal right and the legal authority to be able to appeal to Caesar. And for Paul, it makes me wonder if Paul knew that it was going to end up like this, and he may have suspected that it would, or if in that moment, when Festus is asking, whether it was a surprise to him that Festus would even say, hey, let's go to Jerusalem, let's talk about it there. Did it all just click right then and there? Where Paul's like, they got to you, Festus. And then remembering what Jesus said before about going to Rome, I appeal to Caesar. Like, it just makes me wonder how that process of mindset, because you know that had to be in Paul's mind what Jesus said. Okay? He knew eventually he was going to end up in Rome. Whether it was with this situation specifically, I don't know if Paul knew that, but it kind of makes me wonder, did Paul see this coming the whole way down and he just kind of had planned what his response would be? Or in that moment when Festus says, let's go to Jerusalem, are you willing to do that? And Paul just kind of goes, aha, I know what's happening. I'm going to Rome. It's interesting to think about, and it helps us to think about this kind of stuff. I mean, I know it's speculation, but the reason I go into stuff like this is it makes it very human, doesn't it? And sometimes you read the Bible, and sometimes you get in the habit of, the danger is to get in the habit of thinking it's just words on a page. But these are real people in real life, in real situations and circumstances with real emotions and real thoughts. And to kind of think about it that way helps us to picture it in our head and to imagine what that was like. Okay, a very real thought process taking place from Paul and how he arrived at that conclusion to go ahead and appeal to Caesar. You know, if that was planned or if that was all of a sudden, okay, I know what I need to do now. Know what I need to do now. All right, anything else through verse 12?
He gets a long trip free.
Oh yeah,
And protection.
you know, he told the Romans, I've been wanting to come and I just haven't been able to, and now he's getting a free trip there, right? But you know, and that is, you know, part of what, when Paul writes to the Romans, you know, he didn't have any anticipation of arriving in Rome in this circumstance. Okay, that wasn't his plan. But even still, especially after Jesus talks to Paul in the prison or wherever it was Paul's being kept, that specifically acknowledged the fact that Paul knew he was going to end up there. Okay, it wasn't just a matter of when I get around to it or I hope to eventually. No, I'm going to go to Rome at some point. The question is when. As of right now, Paul knows when. Okay, whether he knew that's what it was going to come to or not, he knows now that that's what is going to happen. Yeah.
When and how.
Yeah, when and how. Yeah. Anything else in verse 12? All right, so verse 13. So Paul appeals to Caesar, but there's a problem, okay? For the legal issue to appeal to Caesar required a certain set of circumstances that could not be dealt with on a local or governor level situation, okay? Whatever the accusations were, whatever the situation or circumstance was with the citizen of Rome who appeals to Caesar, it must be a situation that could not be determined, that had to appeal to Caesar. Okay, it wasn't just like, well, I don't really feel like messing with this, so I'm going to send you to Caesar. That wasn't the governor's ability. It was the citizen's ability to claim that in these particular scenarios. And so here in verse 13 and following, Festus knows he's got to write some letter to accompany Paul to inform Caesar what's happening. And this isn't just like, I mean, the parallel we see from Lysias to Felix, right? Lysias wrote a letter conveniently retiming some of the events as to remove any issues of legality for him and his soldiers. but he presents a letter to Felix about very broadly what the situation is. That's not going to fly with Festus to Caesar. Okay, this is Caesar for all intents and purposes. He's king of the whole world. Okay, and if there's going to be a scenario where a citizen is appealing to his judgment, overriding the local law, overriding the governorship of the Roman law, there has to be a good reason for it. And so Festus has to be able to deliver a good reason for allowing this to happen, given the fact that Paul's appealed to Caesar. So in verse 13, after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, so keep in mind, Festus is new, so Agrippa, Bernice, they're coming and say, hey, welcome. And of course, there's some political purpose for that too. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix. You know what, Agrippa, I know you have a lot of background information and knowledge about the Jews, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I really could use your perspective on this, okay? Because as of right now, no letter has been written to Caesar, okay? And Festus, at least as of this moment, doesn't seem to be in such a hurry to get rid of Paul to send him to Caesar, because Festus doesn't really know what to write, all right? And if there was a process to this, or if there was some kind of a actual writing or something that had to be delivered to Rome, I don't know what the details of that were, but specifically, Festus has to write a letter to explain this, and he doesn't know what to say. And that's what's going to prompt a lot of this. Now, I wanted to mention what Bob mentions about Agrippa here, because Agrippa is used a lot because there were a lot of Agrippas. This is Herod Agrippa II that we're talking about here. King of the Jews, he came to Caesarea to extend formal congratulations to Festus, the new Roman procurator, governor. His younger sister was Drusilla. So remember, the wife of Felix, who they were in an adulterous relationship already. Okay, this would have been Felix's brother-in-law, Herod Agrippa II. The wife of Felix, Bernice, was Agrippa's own sister, who was living in an incestuous relationship with him. Agrippa had reason to know much about the opposition of the Jews towards Christians because his official position gave him jurisdiction over the temple and the appointment of high priests. So, and that's the Roman appointment of high priests. There was the appointment under the actual Mosaical law, remember the dual nature of the high priest issue, and then there was the political figurehead that the Romans put in place. So Agrippa was in charge of that. His father, Herod Agrippa I, he was the one that killed James in Acts chapter 12. His uncle, Herod Antipas, had beheaded John the Baptist and had heard Jesus on the day he was crucified. So there's a lot of backstory, a lot of back history here with Agrippa, all right? A lot of stuff not only for himself and his family with relation to the law of Moses, but also with relation to this sect of the Jews, as they put it, the sect of the Nazarenes. So Agrippa has some information. So, verse 15. Festus says, hey, Felix left him a prisoner. Again, I want to emphasize that Paul's not in shackles that would not have been proper under Roman law. Paul's a Roman citizen. No accusation has been specified against him with regard to, or having any proof. It's still kind of in that limbo stage. So when he says prisoner, he's being kept here. He's not being let go. But that's for two reasons. Because one, we know if we let him go, he's going to die, and he's a Roman citizen. But two, if we let him go, the Jews are going to get all upset because they have accusation against him. So it's one of those limbo things. So in verse 15, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem asking for a judgment against him. Everything that Festus is saying is accurate. There's nothing wrong so far in what he's saying. Verse 16, to them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. The second part of that, we know absolutely that's what he said. Luke tells us about that. That first part, Luke doesn't give us all the dialogue. I have no reason to doubt that this is what Festus said, but it's interesting to me because Festus is presenting himself as strict to Roman law when we know that that's not entirely the case. Okay, there was some bias there, and he was all willing to let Paul go to Jerusalem. But the way Festus presents it is, well, we need to have reasons, and Roman law takes precedent. It's not the custom of Romans to deliver any man to destruction, for the accused meets his accusers face to face. Well, they still hadn't done that, had they? They still haven't brought the actual accusers to meet Paul face to face, or to accuse him face to face. That still hasn't happened, and yet Festus was already trying to get Paul to go to Jerusalem. Has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Verse 17, therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat, and that's true. They came the very next day. He sat there and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, again, accusers loosely, the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed. There was no specific, even if they brought up the fact that they're of the specific issue of defiling the temple, the actual people who, quote unquote, were there to see it, they didn't deliver those people. They didn't present them. Okay, so the accusations were hearsay and broad, and for that matter, very specific to the law of Moses. So, verse 18, they did not accuse him of such things as I suppose, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. This goes into reinforcing the fact Festus didn't have a lot of information about Paul's specific case. I think he knew Paul existed. I mean, he probably had to know who all was here and who all were keeping prisoner and who all was under house arrest, so forth. But the specifics of the case, that's why I said such things as I supposed. If there were any, I don't know if the Romans kept express records of, the court proceedings and stuff like that, like we do with Felix. If there were, he would have been able to read it and know what the situation was. But he didn't. So, verse 20. Because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. So the way Festus places it is he didn't say anything about the scenario here. He says, verse 15, they informed me, they asked for judgment against him. Whether or not by saying that he's implying that the Jews wanted to bring him to Jerusalem, I don't know what he means by that, unless he's just saying the Jews want me to do something about Paul. Whether he revealed that they want me to send him to Jerusalem or not, I don't think he did. That is not the way it sounds. Because here in verse 20, he makes it sound like it was his idea let's go to Jerusalem so that I can get some more details on this issue. I think that's him being a little bit equivocal here. And there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed, verse 21, to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. Augustus, and King James uses Augustus. Is that the name of Caesar? What is Augustus? Because a lot of times people point this out and say, oh, this is not right. Yeah, Caesar is a title, and every Augustus since the Caesar in 27 BC had utilized Augustus also as a title. Okay? So Caesar Augustus is an actual representation of the office of Caesar, not the name of the individual. I was going to read this too. Festus was in a bad position. He must send this prisoner to Caesar, but he had no formal legitimate charges to write against him. In his speech before this royal audience, the word Augustus, there we go, which means venerable, worthy of reverence, is used in the King James Version in verse 25. Reese explains that this was actually a title for the emperor of Rome, who was at this time Nero. This title was first conferred upon Octavian in 27 BC, who thereafter was called Caesar Augustus, the name Luke uses in the narrative about the birth of Jesus in Luke chapter 2, verse 1. After Octavian's death, the title was given to his successors in office. So Caesar Augustus was kind of just an emphatic, Caesar's the office, but also he's worthy of veneration, worthy of reverence, that sort of thing attached to it. So Caesar Augustus is not specifying the name of the Caesar, specifying just the office of it. So when it says the decision of Augustus, that's not his name. He's just talking about Caesar. Okay, the name of the Caesar was Nero. And so that's verse 21. Anything through verse 21 so far? So notice how, and for the most part, I don't have a problem with what Festus says to Agrippa. I think there was some, maybe a little bit of equivocation there in trying to take out any biasness that Festus may have had in trying to form a relationship with leaders of the Jews. But for the most part, it was accurate to what he said. Verse 22, Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. And tomorrow he said, you shall hear him. So, Agrippa wants to hear about Paul, hear what the situation is. We'll pick up with verse 23 next Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.